Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Brissenden-Smith. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special live discussion, DEI or Die, the critical state of DEI across sectors. As United Way Bay Area works to maintain and deepen our commitment to infusing DEI principles into the fabric of our organizational culture, we are a learning organization, drawing inspiration, insight, and practical examples from our peers and established leaders in this work. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from thought leaders from various sectors, public media, government, education, and corporate, as they engage in the dialogue about the successes and the challenges we face, especially when the importance of this work is under heightened scrutiny. We encourage you to share your questions for our panel during the event using the Q&A feature, as we will have the opportunity to take some of your questions later in the discussion. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the event. Mia Henry is the CEO of Freedom Lifted, a firm supporting justice-centered leadership development through education and facilitation. Her blended learning training, Justice at Work, has enrolled nearly 10,000 students who are leading equity work across the US and Canada in nonprofit organizations, colleges, and public libraries. Mia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. I'm thankful for the work that you're doing out there to bring more justice and equity to our communities. And I want to encourage you to keep going and stay connected to one another. So, and thank you again for your time today, because we know how time is so scarce. So spending it with us is, it means a lot. Again, my name is Mia Henry, and I want to just frame our conversation a bit today about DEI and about what we hope you all come away from this conversation with. The purpose of our time together is always to create community, so we can do that through the questions that you ask and through. I've already had the great pleasure of building community with our fellow panelists. We also want to offer a viewpoint of the state of DEI from different perspectives, people in different sectors, and let you know what we're seeing as trends and what is possible. What does it look like for us to stay committed to this work, even if you have to call it something different? We want to encourage you to stay the course. So that's really the purpose. And we hope your outcome, we hope you come away from this conversation with new insights on how to strengthen the work, encouragement, as I said before. And we know that it's not always just attacks. Sometimes it's just broken promises. Sometimes it's just apathy, right? Sudden lack of interest, if you will, right? Fewer resources, fewer people taking your meetings, you know what I mean? So we have to make sure that we are able to stay in this work and stay encouraged, even with all of the both explicit and implicit ways that it is being undermined. I also want to talk about a few things around DEI, the way I've been thinking about it, and the way that I hope, in the spirit of encouraging you, you can also think about it in connection to your work. First of all, a new report just came out from Democracy Forward. We can share the link with you a little bit later, but it's tracked more than 70 cases, court cases around DEI, and it provides examples of dozens of cases filed after the Supreme Court ruled to prohibit the explicit use of race. Oh, I'm sorry. You do have a poll. We are wondering where people are coming from. So let's stop. I'll stop there and let everyone fill out the poll. So you have a quick poll we have out there for our almost over 100 participants. And great, you should see it to let us know which sector best describes where you do DEI work. All right, so we have about 75% of you who've participated. We can go ahead and share the poll. More than half of you are coming from nonprofit organizations, And we have quite a few people on here who are representing companies or small businesses, for-profit sector. We have about 11% who are representing the public sector, and the remaining are either in training, consulting, and higher education. We have one person out there in the media. We need you, media person. So thank you all for joining, and this is great to help us really understand who's in the audience today. Thank you so much. All right. And yeah, so we're gonna, that's good to know. I wanna keep talking about this report, and then we'll launch another poll to see where everyone is. Okay, so where are you coming from? This is the next poll. Where are you coming from? Where are you calling in from, I should say. We wish you were here in person, but you're not. All right, and you do have a West Coast and a Bay Area. So if you're in the Bay Area, choose Bay Area. And then everyone else choose West Coast. All right. Let us know where you are located, where you're joining us from here. Fantastic. All right, so I think we can go ahead and share the results of this poll so that everyone can see where we all are. So we have about 40% of us are from the West Coast, and 30% are from the Bay Area specifically. So most of us are on Pacific time right now. It's lunchtime, so maybe you're snacking while you're watching this. And we have quite a few people from all across the country as well. So this is a great cross-section of folks geographically and around sectors who are joining us today. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Colleague Tomas is launching our polls for us. Thank you, Tomas. All right. So given that, we know that the courts across the country are constantly, this is one of the tactics around undermining the work of DEI, is to create a lot of lawsuits around it, right? But as I was saying before, this report by Democracy Forward is actually saying that the vast majority of DEI programs that are being challenged remain on solid legal footing. They are finding that people are not being harmed by DEI, and many cases have been thrown out on technicalities. The courts are also have affirmed that anti-discrimination, equal employment opportunity, and diversity trainings are lawful. And EEOC has detailed such sessions are crucial and support greater compliance with civil rights laws. So I want you to know these scare tactics, this narrative around DEI being harmful, hurting children, hurting organizations and corporations, not founded by data, and it's not being upheld in courts. And those that out there that are cowering to these scare tactics are being cowardly, right? They likely did not, if they're dropping DEI, like, you know, a hot pocket, then they probably didn't have a genuine commitment to the work in the first place. So I want you to know that we know that you do have that commitment, and we're glad that you're here. So yeah, I just want to make sure that we are clear, be clear about the issue. We can definitely talk about the definitions of DEI and what that means, but I want to make sure that before introducing our fantastic panelists, we are clear about the issue that the work of DEI precedes the language, right? If we've been working on justice and equity, many of us have been doing it before. It was under the term DEI or DEIB or EDI. Our work is bigger than that language, and it will outlive it. So even if they're not saying they want to support DEI, we know how to embed this work and protect it. What we really are talking about here, you all, is power. And our fight to keep DEI is a fight to ensure that people understand that power is abundant and not scarce, right? We believe that everyone should and can have it, not just a few. And we have to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to perpetuate this hierarchy of human value in this country? Or are we going to not be scared, but stay committed to our work to disrupt it, right? Our big question, my big question for you all is, are we going to be brave in this moment? And I'm so excited to introduce our panelists who are here to help us understand the landscape, help us stay brave, help us get clarity on how to move forward, and really strengthen our commitments to making our companies, our organizations, our nonprofit organizations, our media, and the public sector more just, right? Especially now in this climate of threats, and these threats driven by fear and this zero-sum game of power. So to help us, I am so excited to introduce our three panelists. Eric Abrams. Eric is the Chief DEI Officer at KQED, which is the public radio and television and independent reporting station in the Bay Area. Eric serves as the internal consultant there for DEI-related issues and helps create a truly inclusive culture for this public media organization. Eric also has an extensive background in advancing DEI in higher education prior to coming to KQED. So you want to wave to everybody, Eric? Yes. And we have Dr. Janice Gassam Asare, who is the author of 2 best-selling books on equity and anti-racism in the workplace, and founder of BWG Business Solutions, a DEI consultancy designed to help organizations create cultures built on racial equity. Janice consults, advises, facilitates workshops, and speaks to groups in ways that spark important dialogue about workplace equity. I personally am a big fan of Dr. Janice. I get her newsletter every week, so I'm super excited to have Dr. Janice join us. You want to wave to everyone? Yay, hey, thanks. And last and certainly not least, we have Dr. Larissa Estes. Dr. Larissa serves as the executive director of the California Racial Equity Commission. So all of you all on the West Coast, and especially those in the Bay Area and California, Dr. Larissa is helping really lead this work in your state. The commission recommends best practices to address racial equity and provides technical assistance to state and local governments to advance racial equity across California. She is interested in integrating evidence-informed strategies into policy and practice across sectors that fortify equity and impact community well-being. So say hi to everyone, Dr. Larissa, yay. So I want to open up our panel with just a question around the state of things of DEI. What is the state of, I would say the state of things, right? So my first question for you all is, what are you seeing, right, that should make us think, give us pause and give us hope? And what's a question that everyone on this, well, you can speak to your specific sector actually, but what is a question that people should be asking themselves about the work, given the political backlash and this revocation of commitments by companies and organizations across the country? So given the time that we're being asked to be brave, right? What questions should we be asking ourselves today? So I want to start with Eric, and then we'll go to Larissa, Dr. Janice and Larissa.
Thanks for that, Mia, and it's wonderful to be on here with everybody. It's good to be here with y'all folks. Boy, what's giving me pause? What's making me sweat a little bit in the media space? And I think there's so much, but I will start with the false perception that everybody who's in journalism is a bomb-throwing communist liberal who is pushing the gender-affirming surgery down on preschoolers, right? That ain't us. I'm also deeply concerned by the lack of trust in all institutions in America, whether that's government or higher education or healthcare or the media. This environment where everybody can do their own research and come up with their own facts is not good for our society, I don't think. And in terms of questions that I think we should be asking at this moment in time, I would be really basic. I would encourage folks to be really deeply basic. What is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusion in the places where you work? Really try to come up with answers to those questions. And I've asked that of people before, and I've seen that oftentimes people really struggle with trying to figure out what inclusion looks like in their workplace or what diversity really would look like. So I want to encourage folks to ask that question.
Really getting clear on our definitions and what these terms mean to us and to our work. Absolutely. If we don't know, we can't communicate it to anyone else, right?
Well,
And
and let's
that
be real.
is,
There are sometimes that we have colleagues and certainly people who say that they're really in favor of diversity, but what they're really looking for is more diversity like that, right? I realized at a very early age that there's a very limited supply of 6'5" devastatingly handsome brothers from Chicago. So I don't just want diversity like me. I want diversity like everybody, right? And I think it's really important to find that in your own head.
yeah, yeah, right. I would say to folks, we don't want just new faces, right, in broken places, right? We don't want just like, a different makeup of everyone still thinking the same, right? So it's bigger than just changing the demographics, but really being able to understand like what are the different experiences people are bringing, as well as the different perspectives informed
It's
by
so
that.
common in the tech industry, for people to say like, oh, we just can't find any diversity. We can't find any diversity. And it's like, well, where'd you look? And somebody's like, well, I asked the one Latinx guy who lived down the hall from me at Stanford, and he didn't want the job.
Right, right.
You got to
So,
go bigger than that.
yeah. Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, Dr. Janice, what is the big question that people should be asking themselves who are committed to this work right now?
I think that's such a great question for all of us to be thinking about. And I'm so glad to be joining this panel with you all here today. And I'm so glad for all of the audience members that are here joining us. I think a really important question that I always go back to is, what data do we have to support this? And I think that especially with the current times that we're in and the strong DEI backlash, I hear so much what I call like DEI propaganda and things about the space and about the field of DEI that just are not true. We know the common misconceptions are that DEI unfairly advantages racially marginalized groups, right? Like the same things we heard with affirmative action, where people overwhelmingly believe that affirmative action benefited Black people. But when you look at the data tells a different story. And so when I would hear people who aren't in this space, who don't engage with this work, spewing what I would call DEI propaganda, what I always ask is, what data do we have to support this, right? Just because you see Elon Musk or whichever billionaire tweeting something doesn't mean that there's facts to support that. And so I think a question we should always be asking is like, what data do we have to support this? Because when we look at the data and when we look at the specific programs that were put in place to support marginalized and disadvantaged communities, we find that a lot of these programs have been successful in starting to close the gaps, but somewhere along the line, there has been these sort of like misconceptions based on a lot of people's fears that these programs are actually unfairly disadvantaging those who already hold power and privilege. And so I think a question that I always ask people to think about is like, what does the data say, right? For the people who don't believe that systemic racism is an issue, if we look at the data, if we look at housing, right? If we look at our education system and different school systems, if we look at pay gaps and pay inequities, if we look at just different aspects of our workplace, we see that there are these racial disparities. And so even if you don't believe that this issue exists, the numbers and the data doesn't lie. And so we should really be thinking about like, what is the data, or where can I find this data that indicates that this is an issue or that these disparities actually exist? So what is giving me hope right now is that there are a lot of companies that still want to invest in this work, right? There are a lot of organizations that are still willing to invest in the work, but what is making me a little bit, I don't want to say it makes me nervous, but what is giving me pause is that there are a lot of companies that are divesting from this work, that aren't investing money into it, that don't see the value in it anymore. And so it's a really interesting period that we're in right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the ray of hope, but and still just what your point around evidence, right? Like, let's make sure we don't just take what we're hearing about DI at face value, because that means that anybody can say anything, right? and then we feel pulled in multiple directions because we're not able to be discerning around what is real and what is not. So I love that question, and also yeah, sharing ray of hope. I'm going to keep asking about hope, y'all, because we need it. So we're going to keep coming back to that. But yeah, Dr. Larissa, what would you say, working in the public sector, doing the work you're doing to advance equity in California, what is one of the questions that you want people to be asking themselves in this critical moment?
Yeah, thank you, Mia, and thank you, United Way Bay Area, for having me on this afternoon. Just listening to my two fellow panelists, narrative matters, and how we look at data, how we interpret data matters. I even think about, are we even collecting the right data? How are we collecting that data? Are we going back with that data to community and doing the quality checks as to, is this what you really meant? Is this what you're really experiencing? I think that's one element. I think with that though, um, communities of color often have to constantly advocate for themselves and be like, well, we told you, you're listening to us. And so that actually creates a narrative as well of us constantly having to prove ourselves and our worthiness for action. And so going back to the conversation around power, there's a huge issue around the maintenance of power at the expense of others when we're looking at the DEI work and the backlash behind it. And the question that I ask is, how are we being strategic? And how are we being strategic in that this inequity, particularly racial inequities, are deeply embedded within our culture as well as within our systems. And so in order to create transformation, there has to be a shift in hearts, minds, and the system. And in some places and spaces, your hearts and minds can move a little bit faster than your systems. And we have to be really intentional on how we are empowering the systems that we all operate in, whether it be media, healthcare, education, how we are empowering ourselves and each other to not only look at the data, but how do we implement policies and strategies in ways that are mindful of the pace of how you're having to move this work along. And it's not just that, but always coming back to that data point. How are we measuring impact? How are we measuring? One of our commissioners, Dr. Manuel Pastor, talks about it in terms of population. So what are those population outcomes that we're trying to see? What are those progress outcomes? And what are those policy outcomes? So how are we looking at those three levels in order to see the more widespread system change? And I think the element that gives me hope is we're still having conversations like this despite the backlash. Many folks have, run for the hills when it comes to having really difficult and uncomfortable conversations around race, around equity, and around inclusion. And it is sitting in this comfort and being in these spaces that are really important to then lead to change. Change is the only constant. We have to continue to push these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. I want to go back to the question you posed around how do we continue to implement these strategies and policies and be mindful of pace. And I really appreciate you saying that how sometimes the hearts and minds move faster than the systems. And I often see, not necessarily systems, but I do see policies sometimes moving faster than hearts and minds. Too, like the inverse. And so could you say a little bit more about how people who are committed to this work need to pay attention to pace without feeling like they're going too slow, right? Or too fast?
I think in this work, you have to give yourself, as well as others, a lot of grace. The inequities that we are seeing, whether they be within systems, in population outcomes, these were created over generations, and you're not going to solve it. For example, with the Racial Equity Commission, we are charged with developing a framework. It's not going to change with just the publication of a framework. And so you have to understand where people are and meet people where they are, and whether they be systems, getting that baseline understanding. So one thing that we're doing at the state of California is really working with agencies and departments to understand where are they in their equity or racial equity journeys. And in understanding where they are, we can meet each agency and department, because some agencies, such as Health and Human Services, tend to be a lot, when you take a public health approach, you tend to be a little bit further in this equity space than, say, other sectors. And so learning where folks are, you can meet them with where they want to go, and you can create and develop and share best practices. So what works in Health and Human Services, you might be able to adapt and adopt into education, into finance, into technology, but you got to understand where everybody is and meet them with their pace. And it's the same thing with how we engage community. You have to move at the speed of trust. And so doing this work also comes with building a level of trust. And I think there's this emphasis, and we talk about this a lot within the administration, of there's this level of speed that policymakers want to move with. And that's just not how people don't move like that. If you've been a government employee for 20 plus years, you're used to doing certain things the way you've been doing them. And for many other sectors, it's really hard to change. And so there are identifying what are those short-term things you can do, what are those intermediate term things, and again, as long as you're moving forward, what's that next 10%? And that's what we're really trying to look at, is if a certain agency or department is great with their community engagement, maybe we can move them another 10% related to how they're looking at their budget and making decisions using data and equity.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I have there are a couple of great audience questions that are coming in already, and I have one I think that would be great for Dr. Janice. So this one is around this this idea of what companies are doing to maintain and reshape their DEI initiatives. We know you work with a lot of for-profit companies, a lot of folks who had a lot of resources go towards this, especially like 3 or 4 years ago, right? And some way before that. But what are you seeing now with the recent economic downturns and the the political opposition, right? The political narrative in opposition to affirmative action. The question is, how are companies that you are working with maintaining or reshaping their DEI initiatives to ensure long-term impact and progress, especially with the promotion practices, leadership?
It's a tough question. I would say the companies that I've worked with, some of the companies that I've worked with that I see are making progress in this specific domain, have recognized what Dr. Larissa had mentioned, as far as, the change is going to take time. I think that there's always a tug of war, and I'm sure that Eric and Dr. Larissa experience this, where you want to satisfy the employees, right? And employees, especially the ones that I work with, many of them are millennials or Gen Z, and they're, employees from marginalized communities. They want to see change happen. They have experienced harm in the workplace, and they feel like change is not happening quick enough. And you have to sort of navigate that with the fact that change takes time. It's not like these organizations and institutions became this way overnight. And so how do you find the balance? And I think what a lot of organizations and institutions did in 2020 that we all saw was they rushed to implement trainings. Trainings were like the go-to, because trainings feel very tangible. It feels like you did something. So you can say, well, we implemented this training or these series of trainings. But when you want to think about like what long-term change actually takes, a lot of companies are starting to realize, like, we need to have the frameworks and the structures in place, and it's going to have to go beyond just the trainings and the workshops, and that we're going to have to make sure that there is some sort of accountability measure in place. I think accountability is what a lot of organizations struggle with, where you could pour a lot of money into workshops and trainings and having mentorship and sponsorship programs and having different sorts of initiatives, ERGs and different affinity groups in the workplace. But if the people that are causing harm in the workplace are able to continue to cause harm, it doesn't matter how many programs are in place and how many policies you change, because that accountability isn't there. And that will sever the trust that employees have within the organization. So what I've been seeing with some of the organizations, not all, is the shift away from just sort of the surface level initiatives and interventions, and a recognition that there has to be some deeper level work and deeper level sort of like accountability to ensure that the system is actually transformed, versus just the hearts and minds of a few employees are not necessarily going to transform the system. So I've been seeing that with some organizations. Again, this isn't all organizations. Some are just divesting from DEI altogether. But that is what, again, gives me hope, is that I am seeing companies are still willing to invest. Of course, the number of companies that are willing to invest is much less than what we saw in 2020, but that is what continuously gives me hope.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. As our organization provides trainings, right? And we would always be frustrated with organizations that would come in and want the training but not have a goal. Like like right part of our intake process, our onboarding process is like, why do you want this training? Why at this time? What do you hope this training will set the stage for moving forward? Because the training can't be the beginning or the end, right? What has already been happening? We need to know that. And we need to know what you want for your organization, what the vision is for your workplace, and what you want, what's the vision for the communities you serve, as we normally work with nonprofits, right? And public libraries. So that is so important. We know that if people are getting stuck on the goal, they're not ready for training. We don't want to provide training if you don't have a goal. So it's a setup. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it's given me hope that you're seeing folks still stay invested with that. I want to go to Eric. We had this, I haven't given you an opportunity to talk about what's giving you hope. We talked a little bit about what's giving you pause, right? When people are not knowing exactly what they mean when they're talking about DEI and doing this superficial surface level work of diversity, that gives you pause. But what's giving you hope in the media space? And as a person who's in charge of DEI in your organization, I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call who have similar roles in their organizations, right? What are you doing with your team, right, to make sure that you all continue to center equity in your programs and services?
Yes, my vast team of 270 DEI experts. That's a joke. My team there's two of us. What gives me hope is the willingness of my colleagues to learn. I'm really fortunate, and I work in a place with a bunch of people who are deeply curious, and I lean really hard into that curiosity. In fact, coming from just before now, we've had the second in a monthly series that we're calling Curious Conversations, that gives our staff the opportunity to solve DEI type problems together. We just say what the problems are, and then they talk amongst themselves. That gives me hope. The one of the things that really gives me hope is the assumption of some of my colleagues who are less ancient than I am, that the immediate future is quite different than the present, right? The future is going to be different for women. It's going to be different for people whose ancestors come from the global South. It's going to be different for members of the LGBTIA community and members of the disabled community. And we've seen things change, right? I think it's very easy to be dour in the work we do and to be crushed by the the seriousness of it and all the awful things that we've seen. But we've also seen a lot of positive change in our lifetimes, right? Whether it's the election of an African American president, who I can promise you a whole bunch of us 20 years ago would have been like, ain't never gonna be no black president, right? But we've seen that. I can remember when Ellen DeGeneres' sitcom was canceled because she came out. And a few years later, she had one of the most popular shows in America. I think we've seen progress in the country, and it's important to hold on to that and to celebrate small wins, because we're not always going to have giant wins, but we need to celebrate the small wins. And that is what gives me hope.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for thinking about it in this, by taking it day by day, right? Or Anne Lamott says bird by bird, really, not letting the larger rhetoric and the larger trends stop the work that you all are doing within. And I love the fact that you're giving your team that space to problem solve on their own. I know a lot of people in your position, to have positions like yours in organizations, often find it's just one of you or maybe two of you, and you're an island, and everything falls on you all to solve all the problems or fight all the fires, right? And there tends to not be a lot of space for to be generative, right? It's just always in response mode. So I love the fact that you're being so proactive and saying, you know, as the DEI, the head of DEI here, that doesn't mean that I'm doing all the work.
It doesn't mean that I have all the answers. I
Right,
don't have all the answers. And it also doesn't mean I've never made a mistake. And that's one thing I do. I call myself out and I say, you know what? I've done some things in the past I'm not proud of. You know, I stared at an attractive woman too long at the beach when I was, 22 years old. There's a whole bunch of things that I use as examples and say, look, I've done this. I'm not putting myself as a pedestal, but I am trying to get better. And that's what we all need to do. And as we're talking about hope, I'm reminded of a quote that really means a lot to me. And it's that optimism is the foundation of courage. And if we want to be brave in this work, we have to be optimistic. We have to be hopeful. Because as soon as we give up that hope, we're sunk. We can't be brave anymore.
Right. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right. I have a question from the audience for Dr. Larissa. This is a great question, very specific. This person is an RN in the Santa Clara Valley medical center. I'm not in California, so I'm not sure. I wish I was, but I'm not. So this person is in a majority Spanish speaking place, yet very few physicians and nurses speak Spanish. So most of the patients are Spanish speaking, but very few of the staff are. And translator services are available, but they're not ideal for bedside care. So this person is wondering, how can we recruit more Spanish-speaking healthcare workers? This is really looking at language justice and language equity work, right? How can we recruit more Spanish-speaking healthcare workers to the bedside, or hiring specialized in-person translators to the bedside 24/7? There are so many barriers to recruiting Spanish-speaking students into nursing schools without affirmative action.
That's a wonderful question. And I often like to talk about racial equity work in economic terms. So we all pay taxes. Our taxes go into fund safety net systems. And the way that our safety net systems work is when you're talking healthcare, you have a patient come in, they receive treatment, but don't understand the treatment that has been given to them. And this was actually something that happened. See, I'm gonna age myself. This happened on an episode of ER, if anybody remembers ER. And there was a Spanish-speaking patient, and I don't know if it was George Clooney's character or Eric LaSalle's character, but they prescribed the patient a medication, and it said, take once a day. What is once in Spanish? Once. What is once? 11. So the patient took 11 pills, ended up coming back with an issue. Again, this is all played out at ER. And to me, that's just like a very important just note as to the economics behind access and language access is that not only have you caused a medical emergency because you didn't have somebody present to have that conversation with the patient, but now you're costing the healthcare system additional dollars in many different ways, whether they be public or private insurance, because we pay for our private insurance as well. And so, in having conversations within the healthcare system, this impacts the bottom line of your Medicaid managed care dollars, for example, or even the private dollars that or the private insurance dollars that you're getting reimbursed at a different rate, depending on what insurance company you're working with. The way that I think, and this is what I would highly recommend, is looking at programs such as promotoras. And there have been efforts throughout the country to find ways to pay promotoras in being those health experts to support that connection between community and within the healthcare system. There is an organization that I'm thinking of specifically within Santa Clara County, Somos Mayfair, that has done a tremendous amount of work in looking at how do you engage and bridge the connections within language access and community. And I would definitely encourage you all to look there, and I'm happy to make the connection offline. The one thing that I'll say is there has been a huge effort to look at language access within state government. The Governor Gavin Newsom issued Executive Order 1622, which had a focus on language access specific within healthcare settings and systems. I don't think a lot of folks really understand how much language access actually costs. And I think that's something to be mindful of, is that we can't skimp on that, because the cost will catch up with us somewhere else in the back end in our healthcare settings if we don't have it up front with our patient engagement and bedside patient populations. And as someone that had a meeting last week where we had 7 languages translated over 2 meetings, and it was a good chunk of change to make sure that community has access. And we just have to be intentional and do better. And I think there's an opportunity, even in healthcare settings and other settings, to look at the bottom line. When it comes to understanding where there are opportunities to engage and recruit Spanish speaking or other languages in terms of healthcare system and engagement there, I think there are opportunities to partner with community-based organizations that already have a plethora of residents that are ready to go. And I think it's the connecting them into language translation contracts and services. So there may be training opportunities that can take place. And there's always an opportunity when you build out your language access contracts to make sure that you're asking for folks that are relatively close to the community.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. That's some great specific advice for a very real issue that in language justice requires some real resource investment. So, but it's absolutely necessary in order to advance equity in our communities, for sure, especially here in California. All right, I have a couple more questions for the audience, and then we're going to wrap up because our hour is zipping by, not surprisingly. As you all know, again, I subscribe to Dr. Janice's newsletter. You should too. It's so good. She is always sharing some really important insights, paying attention to trends, and also sharing a lot of resources too. And like, I go down the rabbit holes, Dr. Janice, with all of your links and everything. It's so good. So I'm wondering, this is a curiosity for me, is like, what of your writing has been getting the most hits lately? Like what pieces have been getting the most engagement this past year? What do you see resonating with people, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I actually, in preparation for this question, I pulled up my stats because I'm always really interested in looking at like what people are interested in reading about. And interestingly enough, surprisingly, unsurprisingly, my most popular pieces as of like this morning were around Donald Trump and Agenda 47, which is essentially like a list of policies that if Donald Trump is elected, he is laying out and he will implement. And so I wrote an article about Agenda 47 and how it will affect different communities. I also wrote an article about Project 2025 and specifically how it will impact the workplace. And so those two articles have been getting a lot of traction. I also wrote an article, and this article was from 4 years ago, on misogynoir, which is the unique form of discrimination that Black women specifically face. And so that article is still 4 years later, it seems like is still getting a lot of hits. And then I wrote an article about how politicians have been pandering to Black celebrities and how I don't think that's an effective strategy to actually win the Black vote. So it seems like a lot of like political articles have been getting traction. And I actually saw someone asked a question around why politicians, or why do you believe general election candidates are not addressing DEIA, although it's been at the forefront? What I'm going to say kind of answers that question. And I think there is a sort of, a lot of people are scared of talking about DEI specifically, right? Because it's been vilified, because that specific acronym has been sort of just like vilified essentially. And so I think that a lot of politicians may not be speaking about policies that impact marginalized communities because we see all of the sort of vitriol that's being hurled when you do advocate for certain communities. And so I think that a lot of people are interested in understanding how the elections in the United States are going to impact them, even those who are living outside of the US, right? Because we all know that what happens in the United States has ripple effects in every other part of the world. And so I think people are really interested in figuring out, regardless of which candidate ends up winning, how it's going to impact them and how it's going to impact their communities. And so I think that that is also something that it has ties with DEI, right? Because a lot of what has been politicized is, I would say, like identity politics. And so all of this that we're sort of seeing with people, I think Eric mentioned, just what folks are saying about, for example, the trans community and folks who are seeking gender affirming care. All of these communities will be impacted by policies that candidates could implement. And so I think that people are really interested in reading about that right now and figuring out what is going to happen, how your community is going to be affected by whoever is in office, and how to perhaps stop one candidate or another candidate from coming into office. So it feels like it's more, I don't know if anyone else feels like this, but it feels like this particular election is more contentious than any other election that I've seen. 2016 felt very contentious, but something feels different about this particular election. And I think people are really interested in learning more and reading more about that.
Great. Well, thank you for the writing you're doing and what you're sharing and telling y'all need to get on that list. I have a quick question for Eric, and a question specifically for Dr. Larissa, and then we'll wrap up. Okay. Eric, someone was asking, they were like, every job, someone's out there in our audience who wants to get into this work. Thank goodness. Even with everything going on, they want to do it. But they say that, most of the jobs have you need 10 plus years of experience, and you need, a master's degree. But if you could name one or two ways that people can start doing this work, even if they don't have those credentials or that level of experience, what are just kind of entry ways to get into this work? And real quick, because we're almost out of time. So
first thing is to do the work regardless of what your title or your job is or what the organization is. And that's really not fair, because that disproportionately causes, people whose ancestors are from the global South, LGBTQ people and women, to do a lot of this work unpaid. So I realize that's not fair, but it is one way to kind of break in. The other thing I would offer as advice to somebody who's interested in joining this industry right now is to make sure that you have skills that are applicable in a wide variety of areas. The other person on my team, I'm constantly telling her to position herself as a data scientist. So if this work becomes illegal, she can still be a data scientist, right? I think it's important to have skills that are transferable in other sectors, and they're all transferable into this one.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. I love that. I talk to people too about being a facilitator, right? Be a people person, know how to build relationships, because you need that no matter what. If you're going to advance justice and equity above the board, or like you said, if it becomes illegal, below the board, we're still committed to this work, and relationships are the key of it. So I love that. Just making sure that you have the skills, tap into what your purposeful work is, and deploy that, right, in advancement of justice and equity. Love it. The last question before we wrap up is specifically for Dr. Larissa and your work with the Racial Equity Commission. We have someone who was asking about how the state DEI framework and models can be shared across different local social equity commissions. And so that's in California, but also could apply to other folks in other states who are trying to benefit from the work that's being done and in the capital, if you will.
Absolutely. So the commission in California has been charged with developing a racial equity framework by December 1st, 2025. And for the last year, as well as in the next year, we'll be doing a significant number of public meetings as well as community engagement opportunities to really understand in a public venue, how do you build a framework that is not only something that shifts systems within government, but more importantly, looks across sectors. So that is something that the Newsom administration is extremely interested in, is how do we work across sectors? And the other thing that is unique with the commission is that we've been charged with providing technical assistance with local government as well as other entities on how do you build out either adopting or adapting your own framework, or what are the things you need to think about as you're moving along, because every community is very different, every sector is very different. But some of the questions that we ask ourselves around, Dr. Janice brought up, how are you applying data? How are we looking at narrative when we talk about media? How are we making decisions on how we allocate our funds? Any entity, no matter what sector, should be able to apply that, and just the basic question, just with some adaptations to meet their needs. So we will definitely be building out a framework that can be adaptable and adoptable no matter what sector that you are in. And the Racial Equity Commission does have a website, and you're more than welcome to take a look and join our meetings either in person or virtually. We'd love to have everyone on this call be part of that conversation for the next year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll try to drop that link to the website in the chat for everyone. There was also a question that came in about the report that I mentioned from Democracy Forward at the start of our conversation. So I just dropped the link to that chat, in the chat for everyone as well. So yeah, well, we're almost end of time. I know that we're asking for more questions, but y'all we only have like a couple of minutes left. So hopefully we'll still gather all the questions and get an idea of where people's curiosities remain, and we can follow up with folks and try to share more resources to address the questions. But my last question for everyone, all of these, you all are so fantastic. I could stay in conversation with you all day. Is what advice would you give folks, to just stay encouraged at this point? Like, what advice do you have for the community, the people here who are dedicated to the work, but they're still they're doubting themselves, or they're facing external resistance? So just like in one or two sentences, what do you want to share with people as they go off into the rest of their day, their week, and their work? So let's start with, Dr. Janice. I was going to start with you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, I think it's important to find community. What really keeps me going is just being in community with other folks who do this work, us commiserating over, whatever it is that we're going through with the ups and downs of this work. And so I think this is not work you do alone. All of us need each other. And so it's important for us to understand that, like we can't do this work as individuals. We have to really lean on our community. So I would say just find a community of people who are doing this work, whether it's through in-person events or, your online community, and just lean on them for support, especially now when
Yes.
things feel so contentious.
Yes, absolutely. Find your people and stay with your people. Eric, what is the advice that you would give our community?
I'll steal a line from an old Apple ad campaign, and I'll say, think differently. Um, there's so many aspects of diversity that we didn't even touch on in this conversation. One that's important to me is faith, right? And for a lot of people, that's the third rail. So I would encourage you to think differently and expansively about diversity. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is never forget that this work is incredibly joyful. It is joyful to learn about different cultures, different ways of living, different faiths, different sexual orientations, different everything. It doesn't have to be like, oh, now we're celebrating 425 years of European oppression in North America. No matter how true that is, we can talk about the joy in this work. And that's what keeps me going.
Absolutely. I'm taking notes myself. So I have my little affirmations every day. Dr. Larissa, you're last. What advice would you give our community?
Wow. I'm bring the two panelists together in terms of your community and the joy and recognizing that self-preservation is okay. You do not have to martyr yourself over this. Just know that you have a community behind you that has your back. And rest is resistance. So be sure that you're building in rest for yourself.
Thank you so much. And if I can add, I remember that you are not alone. And just as Dr. Janice was saying, find your people and stay close to your people. And remember that your work is building on the work of our ancestors who are doing this work, our elders who are doing this work, and you are creating a foundation for our descendants who will continue to do this work, right? So we are part of a long freedom struggle, y'all. And and resistance will always be there. But if we have each other, right, we stay rested, we preserve ourselves, we center the joy, and we stay close to our people, we'll be okay. So I am thankful so much to the panelists, and yeah, thank you for United Way of the Bay Area for hosting this. I want to toss it back over to Sarah to close up.
Thank you so much, Mia. I'm going to echo a few things that you all have already shared. First, though, I'd like to really extend gratitude to our esteemed panel for sharing your time, your knowledge, and your perspective with us today. And thank all of you who joined us for this dynamic conversation. So as we leave today, you've already heard a little bit of this. And as we move forward with this work, individually and collectively, I'd really like to ground us in the tremendous importance of this work. Making our communities and our world more diverse, more inclusive, and more equitable is structural and systemic work, and it is generational. So we benefit from the lessons and the legacy of those who have come before us with a brave vision and the audacity to create a world that is just, safe, and welcoming of us all. So today we've had an opportunity to reflect on how far we've come, the amazing work that continues across sectors and around the country. So we hope you're inspired to continue your DEI work with a renewed sense of purpose and dedication to create equitable and inclusive environments at work and in our communities. On behalf of United Way Bay Area, I want to thank you for your willingness to learn with us today. We welcome all of you to continue to learn with us through a tool that we use at our organization called The Journey, which is a curated collection of DEI resources from books and podcasts to films and even a kids' corner. So I'll ask my colleagues to drop the link in the chat one more time. Please follow us on social media and continue to be in conversation with us and with all of these wonderful panelists and the amazing work we're doing. In the meantime, we hope we'll be able to connect with you again in the future, and we hope you have a great afternoon.